Okay, thank you so much to everyone again who is joining today. Um, just to get started, excellencies and distinguished guests, my name is Cindy Ebbs, and I'm a senior policy advisor and acting co-director of Control Arms. And we're so pleased to host this event today in the margins of a now completed Conference of States Parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. It's my distinct privilege to serve as moderator today for a discussion on the impact of irresponsible arms transfers on current conflicts and how the ATT can make a difference. The areas that we will discuss today are the Tigray region of Ethiopia, the Sahel, Libya, and Yemen. Of course, it is with regret that I point out there are many other conflicts happening around the world, all of which require attention with regard to the supply of arms into the region. One of these conflicts is happening in Palestine, and the impact of the arms transfers on this conflict was explored in depth in an event earlier this week. But there are others still, and there will be more. Control Arms is dedicated to support efforts to stop irresponsible arms transfers that fuel conflict and armed violence around the world. We have over 150 organizations in our coalition that work to reduce human suffering resulting from the irresponsible arms transfers in many contexts and capacities. I want to take this opportunity today to thank all of our coalition members and partners publicly for their ongoing support of this effort and for their active engagement in the ATT CSP proceedings this week. We have a very distinguished set of panelists today with extensive experience in their fields, and I'll give a very brief introduction to the event, and then I'll turn it right over to our panelists so that we can get the most out of their time that they're spending with us. And after the panelists' presentations, we'll have time for questions and answers. Just a few technical notes. This is a webinar format, so please place your questions into the Q&A box, which will be open throughout the event. With the help of our Control Arms team, I'll convey these questions to our panelists after all the panelists have contributed their remarks. And if we're able to combine questions of a similar nature for our panelists, we will do so. Today's armed conflicts are complex, involving multiple warring parties and their supporters within and across borders for extended periods of time. All too often, these conflicts are marked by flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. While irresponsible transfers challenge these norms and can prolong and intensify conflict, the Arms Trade Treaty can make a difference, but only when states parties apply its provisions with care and consistency. The objective of the event today is to examine the role of arms transfers in fueling violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in the context of armed conflicts, and how the ATT, when applied and implemented effectively, can reduce human suffering. The event will explore the effects of irresponsible arms transfers on current conflicts happening, as I mentioned earlier, in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, the Sahel, Libya, and Yemen. Important research and insights on the state of play in these regions and the impacts of arms transfers on the respective conflicts will be presented. Finally, for each context, the panelists will be asked to highlight how a more effective and consistent application of the ATT would help to curb the incidence of IHL and international human rights violations in these regions. I'll now introduce our first panelist, Ms. Nazanin Moshiri. Nazanin is a British Iranian journalist, and she spent the last decade in Africa. She was a presenter, correspondent for Al Jazeera English, and spent 3.5 years as an arms and armed group expert for the Security Council's panel on Somalia. More recently, her role as senior journalist for Reuters in East Africa has involved producing reports on the key regional political and security developments, including in the conflict in the Tigray region. Today, Nazanin will be speaking on the impact of arms transfers on the situation in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Nazanin, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy, for that introduction. The situation in Ethiopia currently is extremely concerning. We know that northern Ethiopia has been racked by violence since November last year, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed sent troops into Tigray to topple the TPLF, which is the regional, or was the regional ruling party. At the time, he said the move came in response to attacks on army camps. We know that although Prime Minister Abiy promised a quick and decisive victory, that didn't happen. And the war has dragged on for months, triggering acute humanitarian crisis in the region. Now, more recently, the fighting has spread to other areas of the country. The government is struggling to contain outbreaks of ethnic and political violence that we've seen over land and resources. Just a couple of weeks ago, gunmen killed at least 150 people in Western Ethiopia in an attack against local residents there. And we've seen many such attacks in recent months. A lot has been said about the humanitarian situation, but I will repeat it here. It is dire. More than 2 million people have been displaced. That's according to the United Nations. And millions more need aid. They need food, water, shelter. And I guess the most serious situation is that around 400,000 people are living in famine-like conditions in Tigray. So more recently in June 28th, the Ethiopian government announced a ceasefire. And that was seen as a positive step after its troops withdrew from Mekelle. But that ceasefire hasn't materialized. The fighting has continued. And recently, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has urged Ethiopians, including Ethiopian students, to join the fight, to take up arms and join the fight. We've seen the TPLF also, in the meantime, recruiting and gaining ground in neighboring regions of Afar and Amhara. And we've also seen concern from the US and also from the EU that potentially large numbers of Eritrean forces have basically re-entered Ethiopia after withdrawing in June of this year. So we have multiple players in this conflict who are basically armed to the teeth. And we're looking at arms and training ranging from the professional well-armed forces to basically what are teenagers and also aging recruits who are operating for militia armies in the region. So if we could just look at the forces that are currently participating, then we can look at where they're getting their arms from. Ethiopia, of course, the Ethiopian National Defense Force, the NDF, has around about 140,000 active personnel. Most of them are in the army, and its troops have been tested by Al-Shabaab, the Islamist militant group in Somalia, as well as rebel groups in Ethiopia's border regions. And they participated in a 2-decade border war with Eritrea that only ended recently in 2018. There's no doubt that the army suffered a major setback when forces from Ethiopia's Tigray region recaptured much of the territory in June. And what we know about the TPLF is from its history. It has a formidable fighting history. Tigrayan fighters led the rebel march to drive out the Marxist Derg regime in 1991. And they basically bore the brunt of the Eritrean war all those years. And it is likely that in November, they seized heavy weaponry from the Northern Command takeover in Tigray. We're looking at potentially a new Eritrean deployment, which has come basically months after Ethiopia said that these Eritrean forces had pulled out. The Eritrean forces are also very well armed, heavily armed. And of course, in Eritrea, conscription to the army is compulsory. So they have a very, very large fighting force as well. And if they do come back into the conflict, we are looking at an even greater escalation of fighting, which will give the Ethiopian forces, the ENDF, probably a boost and advantage in this conflict. Now, as we've seen in other conflicts in the region, particularly after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, although the storage of arms and ammunition in these regions is crucial and weapons and ammunition management is important, it can't prevent the capture of weapons in conflict situations and in insurgency type situations. And the Libya conflict, for example, led to a proliferation of arms, the impact of which is still being felt today from the Sahel all the way to Central African Republic. And we've already seen movement or attempted movement of weaponry from Ethiopia, from this theatre of conflict across into Sudan. The Sudan's Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, have seized significant amounts of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment on its eastern border with Ethiopia in Kassala state. So it's very difficult in these types of conflict where all sides are awash with arms to deal with the current situation, especially when all sides are calling upon ordinary citizens, civilians, youngsters, farmers, the elderly to join forces and basically take up small arms as well. And to make matters even worse in Ethiopia, we have seen rape and sexual violence being used as a weapon of war to inflict terrible physical and psychological damage on women and girls in Tigray. Amnesty International, of course, as well as numerous news outlets, including Reuters, have investigated and documented hundreds of incidents where women were basically subjected to brutal, degrading treatment by forces taking part in the conflict. And there is a real case here for potential war crimes and even crimes against humanity being committed during the brutal conflict that we're seeing in the region. Ethiopia and Eritrea, of course, are not parties to the ATT. And until 2018, there was a UN arms embargo on Eritrea, which was lifted partially because of its peace agreement with Ethiopia. So there are no ATT sort of members in the region or party to this conflict, but we have seen, for example, France, which is a state party, reportedly suspending military cooperation with Ethiopia recently due to concerns about the conflict in the northern part of Tigray. So the reports which came out at the time in June were that a deal between France and Ethiopia, which was made in March 2019, was suspended at the beginning of July. Under that deal, France would have basically loaned money to help Ethiopia set up a navy. Even though Ethiopia is landlocked, the navy probably would have come out of one of the ports in the region. So that is one example potentially of where ATT state parties could have an impact on preventing arms transfers or military or money which was to be provided for military equipment to the region. Unfortunately, what happens next in this conflict, which is impacting on millions of people in the Horn of Africa, is really unclear. For now, what we're seeing is that the TPLF appears to have the advantage in the situation. Some analysts are suggesting, however, that perhaps they are overstretching themselves as they are fighting on multiple fronts. But as I mentioned there, if Eritrea does come back into this conflict, then that would certainly escalate things. And we've also seen the government launching a recruitment drive and basically threatening new operations in the region. And what we're seeing as well is that there seems to be very little appetite for any of the sides party to this conflict to back down, basically keeping the same stance as they have throughout the conflict, refusing offers of mediation. For example, an offer from Sudan to mediate was refused by Ethiopia recently. And what we're seeing at the level of the UN Security Council, I guess, is African Union-led negotiations being favored over other types of negotiations. the AU did recently appoint the former Nigerian president, Obasanjo, as a mediator. That's a potentially interesting step there. But at the Security Council level anyway, the Security Council appears to be powerless, really, and it hasn't really been able to take any significant action on the crisis. And we've seen that both China and Russia really want a local solution. They want an African solution to this. They don't want interference. They don't want sanctions, like the sanctions that were imposed by the US, for example, on the Chief of Staff of Eritrea's defense forces, which they believe will just worsen the conflict. But if we do get to a stage where these parties can be brought together, where there can be some sort of a peace agreement or a sit-down agreement between the various parties, certainly that agreement needs to include a strong element of demobilization, disarmament, particularly of what we've seen of the civilian militia groups, which have grown in strength during this period, grown in strength in numbers and also in arms. I think that is extremely important. But unfortunately, I think we're a very, very long way away from that.
Thank you so much, Nazanin, for these comments and this insight that you have on what's happening in the region. I'm sure that once we get to the questions and answers, we'll probably have quite a few for you, because it does seem to be escalating quite a bit and quite quickly. At this point, I'd like to turn to my colleague, Usman Diallo. Usman is a researcher for Amnesty International West and Central Africa Region Office, and he is working on the Sahel region. He's a holder of a PhD in global governance from the Balsili School of International Affairs from Wilfrid Laurier University, and his doctoral thesis was on the response by African security actors to the crisis in Mali. Today, Usman will be speaking on the impact of arms transfers in the Sahel region and will share with us the latest research produced by Amnesty International. Usman, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and good morning or good afternoon to all the panelists and attendees of this webinar. So today I'm going to present a research that we conducted this year on the Sahel arms transfer, by various army groups. And just for an introduction, the Sahel has been afflicted by an Islamist insurgency since 2013. So we have, it all started with the conflict in Mali in 2012, when many groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda overran the country. And following the international intervention led by France in 2013, and following the deployment of a UN mission in Mali, the insurgency spread from Mali, affecting neighboring Burkina Faso and also Niger, but also Mauritania and countries that have been at the outskirts so far, such as Côte d'Ivoire, whose regions in the north and in the east are increasingly affected by this insurgency. So just to give a bit of a background, we have groups that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the Sahel, such as the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims. We have also a local franchise of the Islamic State that is operating in the region, which is the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. And given the Islamist insurgency and how the conflict took an increasingly, communitarian tone beginning in 2017, we have had the rise of self-defense militias in the region, starting first in Mali with a local militia named Dana Ambasabu, which is operating in the central region next to the border with Burkina Faso. But also we have had former militias that were involved in fighting banditry in Burkina Faso, such as the Pogluogo, being operating increasingly as auxiliaries to the government for counter-terrorist operations. And since 2020, Burkina Faso has kind of formalized this relation with self-defense militias by drafting a national law on volunteers for the defense of the homeland, which gives many of those groups a legal backing to operate alongside the Burkinabe security and defense forces, despite them committing human rights abuses and violations. So just in this context, since 2017, we have had a rise also of civilian casualties in the Sahel due to all these groups operating in the region. And basically what we did in this research was to collect open source data by all those groups in the Sahel, Islamist and self-defense militias, collecting information and propaganda materials that they published through their Telegram channels, WhatsApp groups, Facebook, social media. And we have amassed around 400 pieces of digital content between January 2018 and May 2021, and to do an analysis about the weapons that they carry. Following this analysis, we discovered that if many of the weapons that they carry are legacy Soviet weapons, such as AK-47, there is a substantial part of recent and modern weaponry that did not exist in the region or that did not circulate in the region prior to 2013. And in this instance, it was mostly Zastava machine guns made by a Serbian company, and that we saw being in the digital content that we analyzed. So some of these digital contents are propaganda materials by Islamist groups showing weapons that they looted after they engaged with some of the national governments of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But some of those other materials are propaganda pieces that were made by self-defense groups, such as the Koglueogo, and sometimes they feature these very modern weapons while taking pictures with special units of the Burkina Faso Special Forces, such as the Unité Spéciale de la Gendarmerie Nationale du Burkina Faso, which is a special unit of the gendarmerie and that has been active in counter-terrorist operations in the northern region, and that possessed the Zastava rifles. So in this context, there is also an human rights violations element, because since 2021, we have seen a rise of indiscriminate attacks against civilian communities in the Sahel. It started at the beginning of the year in Niger, in the Tigray region, where 2 villages were attacked and around 103 civilians were killed by members of the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, because in their propaganda, they claimed that these villages were refusing to pay taxes that they levied on these communities. There are rumors that the villages killed or drove off a tax collector from the Islamic State, and that led to that retaliation by the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. But the human rights situation and the danger to the civilians is not only limited to those 2 villages, unfortunately, because since the beginning of the year, there were similar attacks against villages in the area that is called the tri-border region. So that is southeastern Mali, western Niger, and northeastern Burkina Faso. And there have been around 600 civilians deliberately killed by the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara in this region over a span of 6 months. And that creates a real concern, because many of those weapons that were used to target civilians are derived or taken from the stocks of the Sahelian countries and their armies. The Zastava rifles, we know for certain that there have been trade agreements between Serbia, Zastava, and the government of Burkina Faso as late as 2018 that led to the delivery of weapons, including some of those machine guns that we documented being used by some of the armed groups in the Sahel. And I think that is the main point about this research that we did, that many of the weapons that is being used by armed groups in the Sahel are directly taken from the stocks of the national armies of the region. There are various ways in which this operates. For the Islamic State, we suppose that it's from attacks that have been conducted against the garrisons of those armies in late 2019, 2020, that led to the diversion of those weapons. But for the self-defense groups, such as the Koglueogo and the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, given their close proximity with some of the security and defense forces, there are possibilities that there is an illegal diversion made by local commanders to those armed groups, and that contributes to the further insecurity for the civilian communities. Now, regarding the Arms Trade Treaty, it is clear that a human rights situation assessment needs to be done prior to conducting illicit trade of weapons and arms. And if the importing countries cannot assess correctly or control correctly or record correctly their arsenal and storekeeping, I think there needs to be a tougher assessment and even a suspension of arms trade into those countries, because there are real consequences for the civilian populations. Now, for the Islamist groups, it's mostly during attacks that it is being taken, but we know that we have documented in Mali, for example, during political and military upheavals, such as those that happened in 2020 and 2021, when the legitimate government was toppled by members of the security forces. That leads often to a breakdown of law and order, even within the military, and the diversion of weapons from the army stocks and then to the armed groups, because there is an illicit trade that has been going on in the region even before the beginning of the insurgency in the Sahel, that has been going on since the civil wars of the 1990s, in which many of the weaponries and weapon systems held by national governments is diverted by illicit networks, sometimes with links to the military, and then used and sold to some of the armed groups, but also to bandits that operate in some of those regions. Now, regarding the Arms Trade Treaty, I think what this research, which is preliminary and which will probably lead to more investigations about how arms circulate in the Sahel. What this research shows is that there needs to be a tougher assessment by exporting countries, not only about the respect for human rights by security and defense forces that they to whom they sell weapons before they can conduct this legitimate trade, and also they need to assess the risk of armed diversion from national stocks into the hands of some of those armed groups that operate in the Sahel, because there are human rights consequences and real consequences for the protection of civilian lives. And beyond those exporting countries, I think importing countries and their international partners in the Sahel, such as the France and the European Union, needs to work together on better managing their stocks of weapons, assessing clearly who has control of them, and preventing any gaps and possibilities for weapons diversion from the national armies and to the hands of the armed groups that commit human rights violations in the region. So this is basically the research that we conducted using open source data, and it probably only shows a part of the picture, because using open source has its limits. We can only see what has been shown in their propaganda by these armed groups, but it is going to be the first step to a better investigation or a more thorough investigations about the circulation of weapons in the region. And just to conclude, the general idea for a long time was that the arms that circulate in the Sahel were arms and weaponry stockaded from the Gaddafi regime in 2011 and 2012. That is certainly true. That was certainly true. But I think we can conclude that for the most case, since 2015, most of the weaponries used by armed groups in the region come directly from the stocks of the national armies of the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Usman, for these comments and for sharing the new research that you and Amnesty have developed in this region. Very interesting, and certainly, I think, as you mentioned, open source data has its limits, but it certainly will open the eyes of a lot of individuals and will assist in sort of following up with a more detailed investigation. So thank you so much. I'd like to now turn to our next panelist. Our next panelist is Dr. Monsef Kartas. Monsef specializes in security, peace, and development, notably on conflict transformation, security sector governance, armed violence reduction, small arms and light weapons, informal economy, and border communities. And from 2016 to 2020, Monsef served 3 mandates on the UN panel of experts on Libya, established pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 1973. Currently, Monsef is an affiliate researcher at the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding, and also works as an international consultant. Monsef will be speaking today about the impact of arms transfers on the situation in Libya. Thank you, Monsef. I will be putting a PowerPoint up for him, so if you'll just bear with me for a moment, I'll share my screen and we'll be ready to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy. While you're sharing the screen, I start first by jumping on exactly what Usman has mentioned. I mean, I've been working on Libya for many years, and this is exactly one of the issues, is that in the early phases after 2011 and 2012-13, there was this impression and the notion that the stockpiles from the old regime were basically leading to, I remember hearing words like arms bazaar and so on. So it's certainly true that a considerable number of weapons, small arms and light weapons amongst them, have circulated and proliferated in the greater region. But I think that it has been also a bit overblown comparatively to the reality. It doesn't mean it was negligible, but it certainly has never been as large as it has often been presented. And that leads me, if you get to the next slide, to actually the main point, first main point I wanted to make on arms transfers and its impact on the situation and the crisis in Libya. And we have to understand that actually Libya has suffered much more from arms and military equipment that has made its way into Libya after 2012 and even before. And that we have actually an evolution where we can see kind of 4 major phases and steps. And you have the first is around the uprising and the kind of enthusiasm with the fall of the Gaddafi regime, hope for political transformation, hope that inequalities could be addressed, hope that at least there would be some sort of rebalancing of patron-client relationships. We had very early elections. Some would criticize that, but we had then a transitional parliament. We had a drafting of the constitution process that was initiated. But and if we go through all the phases, we see that 10 years later, we had a full-blown out war in Libya, and this has only been possible because they were constant arms transfers into Libya and in total violations to the sanctions regime, to the arms embargo. Other flows of weapons, unfortunately, have happened within, so to say, the poor interpretation and poor application of the arms embargo. So not as violations of the sanctions regime, but where the Security Council could have reacted to this new situation and applied different rules. So we have to really understand that at the end of the uprising, this is actually where we really have the mushrooming of armed groups. And one of the main reasons why we could observe this mushrooming of armed groups was because suddenly weapons were available in much larger quantity. So of course, a large part of that came from the stockpiles of the Gaddafi regime. But if we look at it closer, in the next 2 years following the fall of the Gaddafi regime, we have still a constant flow of weapons into Libya. So, the other thing that leads to this multiplication of armed groups is, of course, their capacity to profit from an economy of predation, where they also get tight links, where key people, key heads, or people affiliated to these armed groups are become part of the political institutions and play an important role in redistributing state funds illicitly. We have then the breakdown of the political transition, and culminating basically in an armed conflict between Fajr Libya and Karama in 2014. And what you have to understand is that this culmination, this was only possible through the fact that there has been a constant flow of arms into Libya, which has allowed certain armed groups to grow, to become more important, and especially has allowed Haftar, to a former military officer who hadn't been in Libya for many years, to come up again on the scene and to steadily and slowly build up an armed group in the east of Libya, and challenge the political process and challenge the institutions. After the peak of the conflict between Fajr Libya and Karama, a political agreement process was initiated, and about 2 years later, this agreement has led to the creation of a government of national accord, and that soon as the ink had hardly dried on that agreement, that Haftar had already torpedoed this agreement. And this was only possible because Haftar knew that he was in a stronger position thanks to foreign backing and to arms transfers that he was receiving. The growth of Haftar, basically all that while there is a sanctions regime and an arms embargo in place, leads to his armed forces to grow in importance and strength. And we have then in the end the peak in the attack in 2019, April 2019, against Tripoli and the Government of National Accord. And we see then suddenly really the open intervention from foreign countries, blatant violations of the arms embargo, open deliveries of arms into the country, and participation, and resulting to also grave IHL violations, grave human rights violations, and immense destruction in the country. We see that we have now a military stalemate that has created, again, opportunities for a political settlement, but its success is doubtful, because generally flows of arms into Libya are not ending and continue to be problematic, and continue to show that the different armed groups have no inclination of giving up their spoils. So if you can go to the next slide. Human rights violations and IHL violations, I think what we can see is that there's been grave human rights violation by armed groups throughout the period. This was sustained by a conflict and predatory economy. We have seen arbitrary detentions, kidnappings, ransoms. We've seen sexual abuse and exploitation of migrants and refugees, torture of Libyans as well as migrants, murders and deaths committed by armed groups, some more and less affiliated to different state institutions or to the different warring camps. On IHL violations, what we had as major events were regular attacks on migrant detention centers. One example would be more recently the mass murder at the Mizne center by Haftar's forces, and where many Bangladeshi migrants were located. We have seen attacks with explosives and shells on health and medical facilities as well as schools. Another example, 2020, was Haftar's forces targeting Tripoli's Khadra General Hospital. Indiscriminate shelling of civilians have been a constant feature of this conflict. And finally, airstrikes that were in most cases conducted by foreign forces, allegedly, according to the panel researchers, for example, at the time by Egypt and the Emirates. But we also have Libyan armed groups that managed to refurbish warplanes and helicopters, which again was only possible through the supply of not only spare parts, but also personnel to do the maintenance. Next slide, please. This slide I just wanted to quickly highlight and why it's important within context of the ATT. We had a two-way arms embargo in Libya. I don't want to go too much into the details. So basically no arms transfers in any way going out of Libya, arms transfers into Libya only for the government and also only with the approval by the sanctions committee. There was then some weakening of the arms embargo at a certain stage. But what's interesting is that in this paragraph, it was mentioned that this was only solely for security or disarmament assistance to the Libyan authorities. And if you often look at the material that was transferred to Libya, it's very doubtful how that specific material and equipment was fit for that purpose. So there has been a weak work basically by the sanctions committee at really reviewing what type of arms and materials would be meaningful for such a purpose as disarmament assistance. Then another element that is really important in the context also of the ATT is paragraph 19 of resolution 2213 from 2015 that has been renewed then also in other resolutions, is that the Security Council urged member states to inspect all cargo to determine based on reasonable grounds to believe that the cargo contains items prohibited by para 9 of the resolution 1970. So overall, over the years I've been on the panel, I would say that this is something that has not been utilized sufficiently by member states. And to cut it a little bit shorter, perhaps I just wrap up by highlighting as one of the main elements that I think where the ATT, obviously a lot of what I've said are relevant in terms of Article 6 and Article 7 of the ATT, but I think we have to look really a little bit more at Article 9 on transit and transshipment, on Article 10 on brokering, where a lot more in terms also of the embargo provision could have been done. Because what we have observed in Libya, the big problem as well for the panel in terms of its investigation, but generally, is that what we have faced is actually retransfer of materials. So other member states of the UN buying material and then having so to say EUCs that are for their country or even for other countries than Libya, but that actually were intended and finally end up in Libya. And all these types of diversion, a critical element for recognizing these problems, for detecting, so to say, these diversions, is to really increase and work a lot more and have a lot more transparency on transit and transshipment. And I think this is an area that, especially in the context of the Libyan crisis, would have required more support, more means, and where many member states could have done a lot more to stop these diversions. I think I don't want to go further in terms of time, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Monsef, for this really interesting presentation. I think for those of us who are in attendance at the ATT CSP, and speaking of Article 9, speaking from my perspective as well, I think too that Article 9 is something that the ATT CSP should pay more attention to. There is a sub-working group on Article 9, which is just getting off the ground this year, and we look forward to more progress in that in the coming years. Thank you so much for your comments. The next presenter is, I would like to present today, is Ms. Laura Duarte Reyes. She is a legal advisor at the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. She studied law at Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Bogota, Colombia, and also studied human rights and multi-level governance at Università degli Studi di Padova in Italy. During her studies, she worked in strategic litigation in support of the Colombia peace process, and she joined ECCHR in 2019 and continues to work today at ECCHR in their business and human rights program. Today, Laura will be presenting an interactive time map that's been produced by ECCHR in partnership with Forensic Architecture, Watana, Yemeni Archive, and Bellingcat. And this interactive time map shows the extent to which cooperation and the patterns of warfare carried out by the Saudi coalition in Yemen is dependent on EU arms supplies. So I look forward to hearing what Laura has to say. And Laura, I will turn the floor over to you now. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you, Cindy, for this introduction, and good afternoon to everyone joining us today, and to all the panelists for their interesting inputs too. So as Cindy anticipated, today I will be presenting the interactive platform European Arms in the Bombing of Yemen, which you can see in the screen now. And this platform was developed by ECCHR, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, together with Forensic Architecture and other partners organizations. And as I will explain further, this platform exposes the patterns of indiscriminate attacks by the coalition against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Yemen. And it does so by exposing the relationships between documented airstrikes allegedly carried out by the coalition and the European arms experts. So briefly, just to introduce the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, we are a human rights organization based in Berlin, and our mandate is to support and accompany affected persons of human rights violations. And to do that, we use mainly legal means, either at the national, regional, or international levels. So through the past years, we have been closely working with our Yemeni partner, Muatana for Human Rights, in an effort to achieve accountability for the Yemen conflict through legal means. But for the purpose of my intervention today, I would like to highlight that in the course of the legal actions we have undertaken, and to which I will refer in a minute, we have found a crucial added value in working in collaboration with a wide range of partners who use non-legal tools, such as legal activism, and also legal and political activism, and also legal and digital interventions. So this interdisciplinary collaboration led to the project that I will be introducing to you today, which is this interactive platform, which was built applying graphic and cartographic techniques to information obtained from extensive field research and open source investigation, as well as legal analysis. And as I anticipated before, it exposes the patterns of indiscriminate attacks by the Saudi-led coalition against civilians in Yemen in relation to European arms experts. This platform was built through the collaborative effort of organizations such as ECCHR, Forensic Architecture, Yemeni Archive, Bellingcat, and GLAN, with each of them contributing to the platform from their expertise and knowledge. So I would like to mention that rather than presenting new finding or research, the platform is, on the one hand, a new modality of gathering, archiving, and visualizing evidence. So it goes in line with what our panelist, Usman, just said before, as open source, having open source as a new way of providing legal evidence. So that on the one hand, and on the other side, we also think that this platform will serve to support our current legal interventions, but also to support future legal interventions around the conflict in Yemen. And specifically interventions that aim at holding accountable European economic and political actors who supply weapons to the Saudi-led coalition, whilst knowing that their weapons might be used in the commission of war crimes. So before I go into answering to the question, how would this platform actually support these legal interventions or prosecutorial efforts, I would like to briefly mention two of our legal interventions in relation to the war in Yemen and European arms exports, which we hope this platform will also support. So first, at the international level, in December 2019, ECCHR, together with Moatana and several European partners, presented a communication to the International Criminal Court asking the Office of the Prosecutor to investigate the criminal responsibility of the managers of arms companies from UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, and France, as well as high-ranking government officials for contributing to the commission of war crimes in Yemen. And in this communication, we presented evidence of 26 airstrikes allegedly carried out by the coalition on civilian and civilian infrastructure, which illustrates the pattern of warfare by the coalition, which is characterized by intentional, indiscriminate attacks on civilian and civilian objects. And what we argue there is that due to the abundance of information in the public domain regarding the violations of IHL by the Saudi-led coalition since the beginning of the conflict, which is also something you can see in the platform, European exports were exported and authorized and exported to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, while knowing that these arms might be used for the commission of war crimes in Yemen. And one of the incidents presented in this communication corresponds to the airstrike on the village of Deir al-Hayari in Yemen in 2016, in which a remnant of a bomb produced by the company RWM Italia, a subsidiary of the German company Rheinmetall, was found. And this incident was in turn then also object of a criminal complaint in Italy, submitted together with Moatana and our Italian partners Rete Italiana Pace Disarmo in 2018. And in this complaint, we asked the prosecutor to investigate the responsibility of Italian public officials for the offense of abuse of power, and also of the managers of the company RWM Italia for the crimes of murder and personal injuries. We can maybe talk about more about this. I'm happy to answer questions about this case, but in February 2021, a judge of preliminary investigation ordered the prosecutor to continue with the investigations and to gather further information relevant to the case. So that process is also going on. So now I would like to point or talk about 3 points that would answer to this question of how can this platform actually support legal interventions. So the first one is that the platform allows to visualize in time and space hundreds of airstrikes on civilians and civilian objects, cultural property, schools, and medical facilities allegedly carried out by the coalition. And this reveals that those airstrikes and the coalition's IHL violations are not isolated incidents, as some UA governments have been claiming to justify the continuing of exports to countries of the coalition. Rather, that these airstrikes are part of a pattern of warfare by the coalition since the beginning of the conflict, and therefore exports to these countries are in contrast with the applicable arms trade regulations, including the ATT, and must be stopped. The second point is that this platform is designed to address the complex structure of the arms defense industry, and it supports transnational investigations. So in the European arms market, defense companies rely on complex corporate structures and also transnational collaborations, which is not only opaque, but also diffuse responsibility. So as such, we believe that both the ICC and national prosecutors should engage in transnational investigations and judicial cooperation to be able to guarantee accountability in this context. And in that sense, we believe that this platform supports this transnational investigative approach, As on the one hand, it aggregates relevant elements of evidence for investigating the responsibility of those 5 countries. And on the other hand, it allows to filter by a specific country and company. So we can see what is actually happening on the ground with the airstrikes that you can see those dots that are geolocated on the screen. And we can also see the connection of European arms experts to those incidents in the timeline. And something else that we can see, and that relates to the third point that I want to make, is about knowledge. So this platform displays a wide range of evidence of the knowledge by both government officials and corporate actors that their actions, so in this case, for the government authorities, the issuing of export authorizations, and for armed traders, the export of weapons, these actions, they conducted these actions while knowing that they might have been facilitating the commission of crimes in Yemen. So this element of knowledge is extremely relevant to establish criminal responsibility, but it is also very much related with the topic we are discussing today, so which is how can the ATT make the difference? And if the provisions of the ATT, specifically Article 6, 3, and 7 of the treaty had been effectively applied by European national licensing authorities, no exports to Saudi Arabia and the UAE would have been authorized. As you will see from the platform, the information that is contained there, which is by no means exhaustive, we can see that the risk that the arms to be exported could be used to the commission or facilitation of serious violations of international humanitarian law or international human rights law was explicit at the time of authorizing the exports, as well as at the time of effectively exporting this material. So the platform includes several parliamentary motions and inquiries, UN and NGO reports, EU parliamentary resolutions, as well as media reporting on atrocities being committed in Yemen that have been regularly published since March 2015. And you could see, you will be able to see from this timeline that at the same time that all this information was being released, licenses to export weapons to members of the coalition were granted and exports were actually conducted. So to finalize, I would like to end with two conclusive points. The first one is that both government and EU traders cannot ignore that they are contributing to these crimes anymore. And we can see that also from all this information we are presenting here. And secondly, that arms traders cannot anymore use the licenses as a shield for criminal responsibility. So corporate responsibility and government responsibility, especially when it comes to arms trade, need to mutually reinforce each other. And we believe this should be at the core of the regulation of arms trade. And what I mean here is that if the ATT should be guiding licensing decision processes of government officials, it should also be something that company officials need to take seriously when assessing whether or not to actually conduct their exports. So if companies realize that these exports, even though there is a license, might be in violation of provisions, for example, of the ATT, or that it implies serious risks of human rights violations, they should refrain from exporting because they, as arms traders, will bear the consequences, including criminal consequences of their decision to export. So I would like to end here. Thank you, Sene.
Thank you so much, Laura, for all of that information and your assessment of what really can be done to address this ongoing issue and concern and this ongoing humanitarian crisis that we see in Yemen. I think just with regard to your presentation, you mentioned that it's not new research. It's just another way to support the research that's already been gathered to really kind of put forth what is actually happening on the ground. And I think, unfortunately, given the length of the Yemen war, this is certainly needed, and certainly I hope will be used and open more eyes to what's happening there, and to all of the reasons to take action to reduce the human suffering in Yemen. Thank you so much for your contribution. I would like to, we have a few questions from the attendees of this event, and I will turn to those. For those of you who haven't yet put questions into the Q&A, please go ahead and do so. We have a lot of information that we've just been shared by our panelists, and so I'm sure there are some questions out there, whether it's on the ATT or whether it's on what's happening in certain regions and how we can hopefully move ahead to minimize the human suffering that's happening. But I'll first start with, there are a couple of questions that are specific to sanctions. And so I think I'll direct these more towards Monsef and to Nazanin, who have the experience for being on the sanctions panel. But of course, if anyone wants to answer, that would be fine. One of our attendees says, as a representative of a licensing authority, I have a question regarding the authorization of export of pistols to Pakistan for commercial use. Which is as it is referenced in the EUC, or the end user certificate. Taking into account the situation in its neighboring Afghanistan, would it be considered as possible that diversion to Afghanistan could occur? Pakistan itself is not under the UN Security Council embargo. So the question really is, could diversion occur from a transfer to Pakistan into Afghanistan? Nazanin or Monsef, do you want to kick it off?
I mean, I'm not an expert on transfers of weapons into Afghanistan. I have covered Afghanistan while as a journalist for Al Jazeera, but certainly I think that could be a possibility. We do know that there are weapons flows. It's a porous border. So there could be diversions there, definitely.
Thank you. Anyone else, Monsef, or should I move on to the next question?
Well, I think I address a bit the same at the same time. The next question. I think what is relevant if you're in a licensing authority is to whomever with whomever you're doing the EUC. I mean, is what is the level of transparency, the level of information that you're receiving from the authority with whom you're interacting? How professional is that authority also? How much information can they share? And how careful are they in answering to your questions and concerns? With regard to Libya, I remember we had lots of issues because there were a lack of clarity, for example, of who in the Libyan authorities were allowed to sign EUCs. And I was always fundamentally saying, well, if this is something you cannot clarify, then why would you even consider producing an AUC and doing a transfer? Because obviously, with whoever you're dealing right now is not capable of managing a simple licensing process with you. So how do you expect those people to be in a position to conduct a safe transfer and stockpiling of the weaponry afterwards? And I think this is really something that is also essential. The other thing is, if there are any doubts, I mean, this is why the sanctions committee is there. Member states should write to the sanctions committee if there are any doubts, asking for advice. And asking the UN authorities on those issues, and see what answer they receive from that end. And I think the moment you have a really transparent and clear answer, and you say, well, we've done all our homework, now we can issue an EUC. But trying to go for shortcuts and so on is already a sign that something is not going to be fine with it.
Thank you so much for those comments. Appreciate it. The next question that is related to sanctions as well is regarding the authorization of the transit of armored vehicles to Sudan for use by Sudan's internal forces. Because Sudan is under a UN Security Council embargo, but the relevant UN Security Council resolutions aren't easy to understand, according to this attendee, because they include several reservations regarding the Darfur region. This is a pretty detailed question, so if the panelists are not able to answer that question, I wanted to pose it in case you are. But if you want to address that question, please feel free.
Well, this was basically what I tried to address.
Oh, pardon me, excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Monsef about contacting the sanctions committee, particularly on Sudan. It is quite complex, but from my understanding, Sudan isn't under embargo, it's Darfur, so it's transfers to Darfur. But again, it's very difficult to prove that the transfers you're making to Sudan won't end up in Darfur. So again, I think you need to get advice from the sanctions committee. You can go on the website there, and there'll be like an email address for the secretary of that committee that you can contact with any specific questions.
Great, thank you so much to both of you. The next question relates to the ATT and universalization, actually. And the question is, while controlling arms trade can contribute to the reduction of armed conflict and attendant humanitarian challenges, doesn't the naming and shaming of countries like Ethiopia contribute to slow ratification of the ATT? And a parallel that's presented here is the resistance to the ICC and some member states' threat of pulling out of the ICC that came with the Kenyan situation there. And the question is, how can such a challenge be mitigated with the ATT? I'll open that question to any panelists who might want to take a stab at it. I mean, I could probably respond first, and maybe the one, unless someone else wants to. But with regard to the ATT and this idea that kind of bringing to light IHL violations and human rights violations as a deterrent to signing the ATT, I actually don't think that that's the case. The ATT is a treaty that states parties where states parties are obligated to comply with IHL and IHRL in assessing their arms transfer control systems, export assessments, as well as transit and transshipment, as Monsef had mentioned earlier. So to the extent that we're identifying where there are risk areas, I think what that does is indicate that those risk areas are key for ATT states parties to consider and to make sure that any kinds of transfers that they're reviewing or in fact authorizing or potentially authorizing are steer far clear from these areas. And if they are close to these areas, that they take great care in making sure that those transfers are monitored from beginning to end. So with regard to kind of using that as a deterrent to signing on to the ATT, I don't personally see it that way. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment. If not, I can move on to the next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to sorry, Nazanin, go ahead.
No, please, you go ahead first. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to reply that countries that are not parties to the ATT already, they do not have an incentive to ratify the treaty, even if we document how arms are diverted or brokered and end up committing human rights violations. So already, and I think it's important to look at the other way. It's not only countries, but also business and exporting countries that need to be shamed because there are human rights violations that is being committed, as we have seen in Sahel, in Ethiopia, and in Yemen. And the fact that countries might be deterred from ratifying the ATT or signing on to the ATT because those human rights violations are being documented is not a deterrent enough. Like, it's not a reason not to name and shame them. And it goes beyond them. It's it speaks to exporting businesses that engage with those countries, and also to importing or to exporting countries. But also it speaks to the international community's commitment to protecting human rights and international human rights, humanitarian law, especially in countries such as Ethiopia and Sahel, where civilian communities are not always heard, because as we know, in Ethiopia there is regularly an internet shutdown. We don't even know that much about the scale of the violations. And for the Sahel, it's almost the same thing, because some of the remote communities, there is a complete shutdown done by those army groups, and information is very hard to assess and verify. So if we can document and name and shame some of those countries, we definitely should.
Thank you, Nazanin.
Yeah, just briefly, I think the ICC situation, ATT, are very, very different. I think the resistance from certain countries in Africa to the ICC was based on a feeling that the prosecutor at the ICC was targeting only African countries, which led to sort of a sense that the ICC was biased in a way. Whereas if we look at the ATT, we look at the impact of the destructive impact of, the unregulated global arms trade on the continent. It has more of a massive effect on the continent here than anywhere else. So it's extremely important in the light of the fact that, African people and governments have suffered because of this poorly regulated arms trade, that, there is a sort of a moral obligation to apply pressure on countries, particularly those countries which are the major arms producing countries and states. So I think that there is very little parallel there between the ICC and the ATT.
And just to add to the ICC, I think African countries campaign against the ICC because the prosecutor targeted head of state and head of government that were committing human rights violations. But in many countries, they are the ones who are handing over rebel groups or opposition figures to the ICC to prosecute. So the campaign was mainly self-protecting, if I can speak that way.
Thank you both for your comments. Definitely very, very helpful. The next question is relating to arms in Libya. The question is there evidence that arms supplied by ATT states parties to countries intervening in Libya, specifically Egypt, UAE, and Turkey, have been used in Libya either directly by the original recipients or through being supplied by these countries to the warring parties? Monsef, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would first refer really to the panel reports of the past 5-6 years and have to look at it for the person. I think there is a lot of data. I think one of the major problem that we have faced is exactly at always having the possibility to create or report on the supply chain in detail. And one of the main reasons, and that is really where it is critical, is because member states like Egypt, the UAE, Turkey, Jordan have actively participated in the conflict, were in a sense active parties, and especially have been at the forefront of a lot of the transfers. They could use, so to say, their privileged situation as sovereign states, if you want, to cover up a lot of the information. So it's very difficult, because basically for the panel in its investigation, they could only receive that information from these member states. And so it has always been an immense investigative challenge. And actually, this has led the panel using more and more newer approaches to data collection and research, like, for example, the use of satellite imagery, but also other open sources approaches a bit similar, if you want, in a very small scale to what forensic architecture has been doing, but reconstruction through open sources and so on. So this is one of the major problems. But yes, so there's been another thing that you have to understand in this context, and the point I would like to raise is that Egypt, UAE, and Turkey and Jordan have now become major arms producers, and this is what a lot of people tend to forget. And this production of weapons also is made possible through other supplies that are coming in. So this can be through, I mean, engineering. It can be through the licensing of certain information and so on. And so there is a whole element of expertise and supplies that go into this country, or actually initially foreign countries. So we see it with UAE, with armored vehicles, where in Jordan, in Egypt, and in the Emirates, a lot of companies are producing under license or have just settled basically branches in these countries. So that these countries basically draw on their domestic industry then for these supplies. So we've seen drones produced and manufactured in Egypt, I mean in the Emirates, and or especially in Turkey being used in Libya. But we have also seen aircrafts and other drones coming from countries that are state parties, or at least countries that have allegedly strict export regulation, and where too little has been done to stop the use of weapons and military equipments that they had supplied to these countries being used in Libya.
Thank you so much. I want to end our Q&As. We have a couple questions that are really kind of focused around enforcement, and it's enforcement of sanctions regimes, and it's enforcement of the ATT. And the question really is, I think, just to the panel, you know, what in your opinion is, you know, can states parties to the ATT and other UN member states do to enforce the provisions of the ATT, in particular Article 6.3, which also includes arms embargoes? I'll just put that to the group, and then we'll start wrapping up. I can probably I can start this one, and maybe someone might want to jump in, and then we'll move to wrap up. But I mean, I think the silence on this is sort of evident because it is a challenge. I mean, I think the ATT does not have specific enforcement features to kind of talk about what to do when a state party violates the ATT. That's part of the negotiation of the treaty. That's part of sort of the legacy of what we have for the ATT. But what we do have are a couple things in the ATT context. One is reporting. Transparency is quite a powerful tool with regard to talking about enforcement. Requirements to be transparent, requirements to report on arms imports and exports can provide information that is useful to other states parties and to civil society organizations and other UN bodies that can indicate whether imports and exports are abiding by the treaty. To the extent that another aspect that can help enforcement of the ATT is also talking more about having more events like this and having more focus in the CSP context on compliance for the ATT. We are 7 years into the ATT now, and its entry into force. And we've had quite a little bit of discussion about ATT compliance. We've had quite a bit in events like these and like today's, and this is one of the reasons why Control Arms continues to develop and support events like this that really talk about what's happening on the ground in different regions and how important compliance with the ATT can be in improving and helping civilians and others in these regions to come out of the conflict and to reduce the human suffering that's happening there. So in my estimation, I think reporting, transparency, and cooperation, information exchange, investigation by sanctions, UN sanctions committees, other investigative mechanisms run by the UN, as well as independent investigations run by organizations like Conflict Armament Research can be very, very critical in these situations and can really raise awareness such that action can be taken. I'll invite my other panelists to respond, and then I think maybe if you want to respond again, feel free to do it. But at this point, what I'll do is ask everybody to just have a final word, and then we'll start wrapping up the event. I'll do it in reverse order. So I'll start with Laura and then move in reverse order. So Laura, if you want to say a few final words, thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, maybe just before that, I wanted to briefly add to your question before regarding the enforcement of the ATT, and would like to highlight the fact that these legal interventions in domestic jurisdictions are really a key step. And I can say that from the case we have in Italy, in which the judge in February this year, and the ruling where she ordered the continuing of the investigations, specifically said that the ATT and also the EU common position on arms trades are an integral part of the normative framework that licensing authorities in Italy should follow, and the non-observance of these norms, so including the ATT, could lead also to their criminal responsibility. So I think that this is an important precedent that we could and should bear in mind in fostering new legal actions or interventions when possible to make the ATT enforced. And in general, I would just like to strengthen what I said before, and it's this idea that corporate responsibility and government responsibility in arms trades should mutually reinforce each other. And in this case, the fact that licenses are granted to corporations that do not exclude their criminal liability when crimes are being committed with the weapons they export, while they know for sure, or they have might be aware of that there is a serious risk attached to their exports. So we should always keep in mind that the license and an authorization to export weapons is only an opportunity to export, but not an obligation. So this the ATT should also guide the assessment of corporate offices when deciding whether or not to concretize these exports. And we are seeing this clearly in the case of Yemen. So yeah, I think that would be my remark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Monsef.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, there is a lot of elements in terms of the enforcement where I think there is a need to increase responsibility of private entities, but of actually all sorts of parties. And if you see, honestly, in my investigations over the years, I've sometimes been really surprised how easy it is for a lot of the companies to get documentation, to produce fraudulent documentation. This is a huge problem, and actually there is another side, and so national legislation have to develop approaches that are actually a bit turning around the evidence so the burden of evidence, so that really companies and entities have to provide a clear notions that are providing basically proof that this cannot be diverted. So I think this is an important step. And another thing that might be also useful, and this is something that then, you know, through lessons learned and best practices can go over from states to states. But for example, some countries have, when it comes to their import regulation, so to say, designated ports of entry, so that certain goods can only come through certain entry points. If something is going through another entry port, then this is an illegal act. End of discussion. We don't have to look at it further than that. And a lot of these kind of adaptation of your national legislation, not just to fulfill minimum standards, but actually to go a bit way beyond and make it act in the end easier, even in terms of investigations. Because by having a designated port of entry, you're already reducing a lot of the amount of work and an own investigation you have to put in something that is absolutely clear, legal, transparent, and so on. Because this is that's not a way that will be used by someone who is acting fraudulently. So there are all sorts of analogies to this designated port of entry that you can apply at all sorts of different areas of transit and transshipment, brokering, and if we have more of these types of rules coming in, it's going to make it more difficult, and you can use your capacities then really to investigate what is going outside of that.
Thank you so much. Usman.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I think one thing for the Sahel is that arms transfer are not always monitored to national governments. We have been talking about sanctions committee in Syria and Yemen. There is a sanctions committee in Mali since 2017, but it is related to the 2015 Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, such as some of the, what they monitor is the violations to the peace treaty and also some of the penalties for those people are linked to assets freeze and also collusion with some of the armed groups. But we know that since 2017, there has been increasing proximity between Sahelian governments and some of the self-defense groups. Like if we talk about Mali, the most one human rights violation or abuse that has been committed in 2019 was when a self-defense group allied with the Malian government attacked a community and killed 157 civilian people. So those kind of things have to be monitored, especially the relations between the government and those self-defense groups. And if it relates to arms diversion, I think it is important for those that monitor like the sanctions committee in Mali to make sure that weapons that are legally acquired by the government and some of those officers are not being diverted to self-defense groups. Last year, I think there was a report by the sanctions committee that showed how members of the Malian government and the Malian intelligence services were colluding with some of those self-defense groups in violations to the public statement of the Malian government. And I think those kind of gaps needs to be filled as soon as possible to make sure that weapons are not unduly diverted to the wrong hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Usman. Nazanin.
Yeah, I think for me, certainly in my area of expertise, I think I'd like to see a more proactive approach to the ATT and by sub-Saharan African states. In the region, there are probably only a handful of states which have industries that manufacture conventional arms and technology, and even fewer states that are exporting these weapons. But we are seeing the impacts of the flows of these weapons, the unregulated flows of these weapons to the region. So I think it really is up to the states in the region to contribute more and to take a more proactive view of the ATT. And I think that these are early days still for the ATT. I think it could make a difference in the region. But it's really important, as we've mentioned here, to enforce and to have provisions on violations, and not just rely on sort of sanctions committees and arms embargoes in the region, but to actually rely on the ATT too.
Thank you so much. And just on that, just to kind of echo what Nazanin had just mentioned and others have mentioned, is that really for ATT states parties, given their collective commitment, states parties have an opportunity and a responsibility to lead on action in these and other conflict situations. So we really do hope that this event has provided everyone attending with more information on each of these situations, and we really encourage you to do everything that you can to support efforts to end the violence. Thank you so much for everyone's time. I want to just say thank you very much to each of our panelists. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. And with that, I will end this session. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.